Hi, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest in a series of webinars from AFRY. Today, we're going to be talking about low carbon ammonia, so green and blue ammonia. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I will talk you through the presenters after just showing you our disclaimer, our usual disclaimer for our webinars. I'm not expecting everyone to read that now, but please don't go and make any investments based on this webinar until you talk to us in a bit more detail. So move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of our presenters today, just very quickly, I'm John Williams. I'm a director in AFRY Management Consulting, and I lead our hydrogen practice, which also includes ammonia, which is what we're here to talk about today. So it's great that I'm joined today by two of our experts. So firstly, we have Josie Armstrong, who is in my team based in the UK, who is a senior principal with AFRY and is an expert in both green ammonia and green steel as well. It's also great that we're joined by Hasan Tarique today. Hasan is based in the US from our Houston office, and again is an expert in ammonia and fertilizers and hydrogen power to X generally. So Josie and Hasan are going to talk you through the webinar content today. I will be here in the background. I will join the webinar again in terms of questions. There's a box in the webinar dashboard where you can ask any questions. So if you have any questions, please pop them in there. We will try and get to as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. If we don't manage to answer all the questions today, then we can follow up with you later on after the webinar. The slide pack and the recording will be made available so you can watch it back again later on. Please share with your colleagues, etc. And so without any further ado, I will hand over, sorry, one more thing before I do that. AFRY has been working in hydrogen for the last 4 to 5 years. We work as one company, so we're one AFRY. We're in the consulting division, but we work very closely with our engineering colleagues in the other divisions within AFRY. We've delivered, several hundred projects in over 30 countries globally since the start of 2021. We've been working on projects from 10, 20 megawatt scale up to multi-gigawatt scale. We cover the entire value chain, and as we will talk about today, it's not just about hydrogen, it's also about ammonia, and the ammonia story is a really interesting and important one when we think about decarbonisation of key sectors. So I will now hand over to Josie, who will start on the webinar content.
Thanks very much, John, and it's great to be on the webinar today. So today, well, first of all, just to clarify, I'll be talking about low carbon ammonia. Just to clarify before we start, what do I actually mean by that? So by low carbon ammonia, I'm referring to not only to blue ammonia, so that's using fossil fuels, to coal and primarily gas to produce ammonia, but in this case, sequestering the CO2 emitted from production using carbon capture and utilization and storage technologies. But also I'm referring in the broader context and including green ammonia. So that's ammonia produced using water electrolysis, powered by renewables, and combined, that hydrogen is then combined with nitrogen, which has been separated from the air. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And at the moment, low carbon ammonia is really a very tiny share of the overall ammonia market. And that is despite the fact that there is a very large pipeline of low carbon ammonia and hydrogen projects. And in addition, there's also rising low carbon hydrogen and ammonia demand around the world, and increasing government support in terms of hydrogen strategies and subsidies and other incentives. But at the same time, despite all these positive developments, what we have found is that the pipeline is progressing very slowly. So at less than 10% of the global hydrogen, green, low carbon hydrogen and ammonia pipeline is at FID or construction stage. And the reason for this is really that it's very complex putting together new low carbon value chains, especially for green ammonia, which necessitates an entirely new value chain through from sourcing renewables to scaling up electrolyzers and integrating them with ammonia synthesis, through to developing entirely new logistical transport and infrastructure to globally trade ammonia on a much larger scale, and developing new end uses as well. So today we're going to talk about some of the gaps or bottlenecks and issues within the low carbon ammonia value chain. And we'll be focusing on, first of all, the gap between low carbon ammonia production costs versus ammonia pricing in the market, and then looking at the need for the emergence of alternative sources of income, namely a green premium or government subsidies. And then lastly, we'll be looking at the infrastructure bottlenecks and just identifying some of the key signposts or enablers of a large-scale uptake of green and blue ammonia. So let's start with the first gap or issue within the market, and that is namely the gap between low carbon ammonia production costs on one hand, which are high, and then market pricing. So what we saw in 2022 was record highs in ammonia pricing, so grey ammonia pricing, and that was, so here we're showing the Northwest Europe price. And what we saw in 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an increase in gas prices, and with gas prices accounting for around 70 to 80% of European ammonia producers' production costs, it led to this spike in ammonia pricing. And at this point, people were saying, oh, green ammonia can now be economic against these kind of prices. But subsequently, gas prices have fallen and ammonia prices have followed to around $350 per tonne, as you can see here, from the highs of over $1,000 a tonne in 2022. And now this gap has re-emerged. And here, so on this chart here, I'm showing you our estimates at AFRY for the levelized cost of green ammonia for 2030 and 2040. So these are on a delivered Northwest Europe basis, and they're really a range. There is a big range in production costs from lower cost imports from places like the Middle East and South America through to some Northwest European ammonia producers. And you can see that there is a large gap still, even by 2030, between around we have $1,300 per tonne as the top of that, from $900 per tonne. So it's a sizable gap, and between that and the market pricing. So we've projected forward the grey ammonia price based on our projections for gas. We then also consider the fact that end users are likely to pay more for green ammonia and blue ammonia to reflect the carbon cost savings. So we factored in the additional carbon cost savings. We expect higher carbon cost savings over the medium term because of the fact that within the EU, in this particular example, we see a phasing out of EU allowances by the mid-2030s, and also a rise in carbon pricing in our AFRY projections. But even then, you can see there's a large gap there, 2040, and this is primarily due to a reduction in the LCOA. And here we have our projections for CapEx for electrolyzers from our AFRY independent market reports, which underline our bid3 power market modelling. And you can see that we expect a significant decline in electrolysis technologies to the mid-2030s in particular. And this is driven by the scale up of electrolyzers and also other improvements, for example, optimization of the supply chain. We expect more automation. We also see optimization of the supply chains and innovation as well, and higher efficiencies. In addition, we do see a reduction in blue hydrogen costs as well, but not to the same extent. So really here we see steam methane reforming and autothermal reforming as more mature technologies, and really a lot of the reductions will be in the carbon capture and storage technologies. The other thing to add is that the costs of ammonia production will also be influenced by policy, and in particular around the rules of additionality and geographical and temporal correlation. And here in particular, temporal correlation is an issue. So that's matching the time period within which the renewable energy generated must be consumed within the electrolyzer, also within hydrogen production. And within the EU legislation, so under the delegated acts of the Renewable Energy Directive, there is a requirement for hourly temporal correlation from 2030, and prior to that, monthly correlation. And here we have some costings. So they're just showing you the relative costing. It's not the actual costings, but compared to the maximum of each metric. You can see that for hourly temporal correlation, the cost will be much higher due to the requirement for flexibility solutions such as hydrogen storage and batteries. And overall, what we have found is that the LCOH in our optimization tool, to meet the hourly temporal correlation, the cost will be around 20 to 25% higher compared to monthly temporal correlation. So that's another thing that affects the ammonia costs going forward as well. So in the face of limited ability to affect carbon pricing, and also low carbon project developers are pinning their hopes on obtaining a green premium to help fill that gap. And a green premium, what do I mean by this? I mean a premium, so additional premium that's on top of the grey ammonia price, and also the carbon cost saving that really reflects the additional value that end users perceive from the low emissions profile of low carbon ammonia. So this is primarily driven by demand and supply factors, but in particular on the demand side, where there is a strong drive to reduce emissions and low carbon ammonia can contribute to an overall reduction in that carbon footprint of the end use product, there will be a strong drive for a green premium. And certainly we do see that within the fertilizer sector, where there are growing targets to reduce emissions amongst end users, including food companies, shipping companies, fertilizer companies across value chains. And also there's policy targets, which I'll come on to shortly. Additionally, the green premium should rise over time to reflect to incentivize new low carbon supply into the market. And certainly with the lack of existing low carbon supply, we'd expect there to be a need to increase this green premium, but it will ultimately, the extent to which this can be done will ultimately depend on the ability to pass through those additional costs to consumers. So effectively for them to share these additional decarbonisation costs. And really that's an area where we've seen difficulty for some of our project developers that we work with, and there's been mixed feedback in terms of their ability to get this low carbon premium. And really, so if you take fertilizers in particular, where we've had a mixed response, there you can see there's really different parts of the market. So you have, in particular you have a premium for brands. So there are examples, for example, Fertiberia has an offtake agreement with beer producer Heineken, and CIP is also working with Danish dairy producer Arla to provide green ammonia based fertilizers, so low carbon fertilizers, to them. And here we can see there's a great potential for a green premium, because both of those companies, Arla and Heineken, have a drive to reduce emissions and to get to net zero across their whole value chain by 2040 and 2050. So here there's a strong drive, but also the actual additional cost for them in their end products is very little. For example, if you take beer, fertilizer accounts for only around 1% of the price of that pint of beer. But if you take the other part of the market, which is the mass market, is really around staple crops or food staples. And we expect it to be harder to pass through these costs here, especially in developing economies, which are more sensitive to additional costs, and there are concerns about food security. So an example here in comparison to beer would be around rice. So rice, for example, fertilizer costs can account for around 10 to 25% of overall price of rice. And there we would expect it to be much harder to pass through that additional green premium. So those are the kind of factors that you need to take into account, and you can see it's very end use specific and location specific. But the other area where we expect there to be potential to develop a green premium, and another driver, is around policy targets. And in particular, where we see there being a potential for an RFMBO premium. So that means where green ammonia is RFMBO compliant, that means it meets the requirements of the EU under the Delegated Act to be a renewable fuel of non-biological origin. And we believe there could be a premium here because it allows end users to meet targets set by the EU so they have set, so here we have examples of how those targets have evolved over time. And most recently, you can see that within the transport sector, for example, around 29% of all energy consumed is to be renewable by 2030, of which 5.5 has to be advanced biofuels or RFMBOs, with a minimum requirement of 1% for RFMBOs. Additionally, within industry, there is also a requirement for 42% of hydrogen used to be RFMBO compliant by 2030, although there was recently a discount negotiated to enable a 20% reduction off that if grey hydrogen was not consumed, if grey hydrogen did not make up more than 23% of the overall mix. and the member state reaches the overall renewable energy target of 42.5%. So overall, I mean, the only other point to add here is that this could add to the potential for a premium for green hydrogen selling to ammonia producers, but there is some uncertainty because recently, last week, there were announcement of case-by-case exemptions for this industry requirement for green ammonia producers, and it will be subject to each member state's individual circumstances. So here you can see that targets will contribute to the potential for the development of a green premium, but the other way that governments can help bridge that gap is by providing subsidies, and Hasan will now talk about this.
Thanks, Josie. As Josie was mentioning earlier, excuse me, one of the challenges for the adoption of low carbon ammonia is the cost of production, and government has a role to play here. And as you can see on the screen, there are a lot of countries that are developing support schemes. There's a range of support available through tax incentives, both on the investment and production side, direct funding through grants, and also funding set aside for contracts of differences. There are a few here that I want to highlight. The US's Inflation Reduction Act is by far the most in terms of funding available. Excuse me. Just around $400 billion of funding available through the IRA, and this funding is deployed through production tax credits of up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen, for the first 10 years of production, as long as you meet the lowest carbon threshold. And the good thing about the IRA is that it has also clarified the definition of clean hydrogen. Anything that produces less than 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen is considered clean, and there are various tiers built into the act that define what credit you're able to get. In addition to the IRA tax incentives, the US also has a hubs program, which provides around $8 billion of grants for the development of hubs, which are basically clusters of hydrogen producers and end users, along with transportation infrastructure to connect the two. In addition to the US, I wanted to highlight what the European Union is doing through the Hydrogen Bank. As I was mentioning, this is a contracts for differences mechanism, which has set aside over $3 billion to support up to €4 per kilogram of hydrogen, and essentially this is looking at an auction or a matching market where the EU goes out and conducts an auction for hydrogen purchase agreements, and then sells on the purchase hydrogen through hydrogen service agreements to customers. The idea being that there's going to be a discrepancy between the price that's being offered by suppliers and the price that customers are willing to pay, and Hydrogen Bank is stepping in and making up the difference. And as Josie was mentioning earlier, the expectation is that costs are going to come down over time, and the requirement for this matching exercise or this the subsidization is going to go away over time. Another interesting announcement just earlier this month through the German Ministry of Economics and Climate Change was made about the carbon contracts for differences, which is going to set aside around $55 billion again to compensate for the cost disadvantage of low carbon technologies for green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen production that can be used for low carbon ammonia production. And this is the most substantial bit of funding that's been announced by any European Union member. But again, the numbers are still in the early phases, so details have to be confirmed. But early indication is that it's going to be around that $55 billion mark. If we move on to the trade flow side, the impact of subsidies and government support is going to be quite substantial on the trade flows of hydrogen and ammonia that we're modeling. So if you look at the current picture before the picture before the IRA, what you see on screen is a view of 2030 trade flows. And as you can see, the U.S. appears as self-sufficient in this view, with very little no exports going to any parts of the world. At the moment, the U.S. is a net importer of ammonia, but what we're seeing in this view without the IRA is that the Middle East comes out as a top exporter of low carbon hydrogen and low carbon via ammonia through to Europe and Asia. But when you factor in the IRA, the picture changes and the U.S. becomes a major exporter of hydrogen and via ammonia and other derivatives to Europe, to parts of Asia, and we see a bit of a loss in market share for the Middle East. The other thing to note is the modes of transportation. When we model the various transportation costs, pipeline transported ammonia or hydrogen comes out to be quite competitive. There's a discussion paper that AFRI recently published that looks at a 3,400 kilometer pipeline from Saudi Arabia through Egypt onto the shores of Greece and Italy. That could potentially provide hydrogen to Europe at around $1.4 per kilogram. But there are other estimates of pipeline hydrogen at around 1.7 kilograms, $1.7 per kilogram. But in any case, the feasibility of pipeline transport is limited by geography, and when you look at certain distances, ammonia becomes cheaper beyond the 6,000 kilometer mark, and we're looking at the ammonia vector as being more competitive than emerging LOHCs, methanol, and certainly liquefied hydrogen. But to transport that hydrogen, there is going to be a large need for infrastructure build. If you look at the current maritime infrastructure availability, there are over 200 facilities of ammonia in operation already, and of the around 200 million metric ton ammonia market, around 10% is the merchant market. So we're looking at around 20 million tons of ammonia per year being transported globally. However, when we look at the novel uses of ammonia and the increase in demand, we're looking at a 3 to 6% increase. And most of this increase is going to be merchant ammonia, which is going to require quite substantial infrastructure build in terms of loading and unloading facilities across the globe. And if we're considering the use of ammonia as a maritime fuel, we're also coming up against challenges to build bunkering vessels and bunkering infrastructure at ports to supply ammonia-ready or ammonia-powered vessels. And speaking of ammonia-ready or ammonia-powered vessels, that's also a challenge. Although ammonia-powered combustion engines are a feasible option, but ammonia fuel cells are still in the early or in the infant stages of development. An ammonia-ready vessel was delivered earlier in 2022, and there are plans for building ammonia-powered, exclusively ammonia-powered vessels. But the scale of the construction of these vessels remains a challenge, and that will be what determines how quickly ammonia scales up as a maritime fuel. If you look at the vessels that supply ammonia globally at the moment, around 170 vessels can carry ammonia globally. These are essentially LPG carriers, and LPG carriers can take up to 30 months to build. So in the absence of ammonia-powered vessels or ammonia-ready vessels that are a source of end use. We also have to contend with, if we're going to be transporting ammonia across great distances over the ocean, we're going to need additional ships that can carry ammonia, regardless of the powertrain that's involved. And then one more point about ammonia's use as a maritime fuel. There are regulatory challenges as well. So, use of ammonia as a fuel poses additional difficulty in terms of handling. Ammonia is quite corrosive, hygroscopic substance, and it can be difficult to handle, and it requires a lot more sort of safety considerations. So that remains a challenge, and regulatory approval of ammonia as a maritime fuel will be one of the sort of early stage developments that we'll need to see before the scale up happens. And then finally, one note about end use markets. When you're looking at ammonia's use as a hydrogen carrier, cracking economics at the import facilities and how competitive cracking costs are can determine the uptake as well. Germany is looking at expanding its ammonia importation infrastructure and improving cracking economics. So keep an eye on that. That will be one of the early test cases to ensure that that we see that scale up or not. And with that, I'll pass it on to Josie.
Okay, thanks, Hasan. So overall, we can see that there's large gaps or bottlenecks, both in terms of costs and pricing, but also within infrastructure and also around the gaps between, in terms of subsidies as well from governments. So here we're just set out to conclude just 6 signposts, which so enablers that we believe are necessary in order to facilitate the large scale up of the green ammonia, the green and blue global market. And first of all, I would say that we need to have clear and mandated low carbon end use targets across the value chain. So this means that end users need to be incentivized to use low carbon ammonia, but the targets need to be clear and it needs to be clarified quickly as well. And also this will enable the green premium to pass throughout the value chain as well. Additionally, we need governments, the financial community and end users to share the project risk. So this means not only governments providing subsidies, loan guarantees, contract for different schemes and other forms of support, we also need to see end users sharing the project risk, for example, signing up to agreements, ideally on a take or pay basis to mitigate the volume risk, or a cost plus basis to share the costs and to mitigate the price risk. We also need to have harmonized and clear hydrogen and ammonia standards across the whole value chain, because to date what we have seen is a lack of clarity has resulted in delays to project. So we need clear standards which are consistent across products and across regions. We also need expanded carbon pricing to just help to close that gap, carbon pricing that covers the ammonia and hydrogen markets and brings effective carbon costs. We need a fast tracking of hydrogen clusters. So these hubs which bring together hydrogen and ammonia producers and end users, they are a great kind of a bed for growing ammonia markets in terms of bringing together those end users and producers to share the risks for economies of scale, to build up the infrastructure and to share knowledge. And lastly, I would just highlight the need for the availability of ammonia-ready technology, because as we can see, the infrastructure isn't there yet to enable the large-scale supply of low-carbon ammonia yet. But we have end users that are making decisions today on assets which have a lifetime of around 20 to 25 years, for example, for a bulk carrier. And over this period, the emission targets are likely to change and there will be a need for low-carbon ammonia. And so we would encourage the development, the large-scale deployment of more ammonia-ready technology. So with that, I'm just going to pass over to John for the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Josie. Thanks, Hasan. So we've had some questions come in on the chat. I've answered some of them as we've been going along, but there are several here that I thought I'd ask and allow you to expand on some of the points that you've made already. So first one for you, Josie. So picking up on the use of ammonia as a RFMBO, particularly in the maritime and the aviation sectors, what does that mean for ammonia demand?
Okay. I mean, at the moment, there are, as I touched upon, there are targets within the EU for RFMBOs, and RFMBOs here does include green ammonia that meets the RFMBO standards, but it also includes other products as well, because it includes e-methanol, includes green hydrogen and other e-fuels. So actually it's quite hard for me to say exactly what that means in terms of ammonia volumes, because it's uncertain how those targets will be met in terms of the RFMBO composition, but also how the different member states decide to meet that requirement. So if you remember, the requirement, I think, was of the renewable energy consumed within the transport sector, which covers aviation and maritime, then 5.5% of that has to be advanced biofuels or RFMBOs, with a minimum requirement of 1% for RFMBOs. So in reality, it's up to the member states to decide on that mix between advanced biofuels and also RFMBOs, but also then within the RFMBOs themselves to make a call around the mix for ammonia versus the other fuels. And also, I'd imagine, well, what we can see from our modelling so far is that the mix, say for example in maritime, is going to change over time. So methanol, for example, is in a slightly more is further along the learning curve. There's already methanol engines. There's more existing regulations. Rather, ammonia needs time to build up those rules, to have the commercialization of ammonia engines and more development of bunkering infrastructure. So over time, I'd expect that share of ammonia to rise as methanol also hits constraints around, say, biogenic CO2. So it's going to change over time. It's not, I can't give one number, but essentially there's different mixes and that mix will change over time.
Okay, that's clear. Okay, Hasan, question for you. And I think coming back to some of the points you were talking about the US and the role as a potential exporter. So the specific question is about the Gulf Coast and whether that's a viable source of ammonia exports. And if so, to which markets do you think the exports will go?
If you look at the Gulf Coast region, there's quite a lot of outbound and inbound port infrastructure there already, right? So, so it's a region that's a hotbed of trade. Now, it doesn't have much ammonia export infrastructure, and that remains a challenge, and that will need to be addressed for the Gulf Coast to become, a major exporter region. But in terms of, I guess, if you go further upstream in terms of the supply that's available in the Gulf Coast region, there are ammonia production facilities in Louisiana and Texas already. The CF facilities also exports ammonia. The other thing is that there's a hydrogen pipeline infrastructure there that's in place already. So if you were to put an ammonia production facility, you could take advantage of the hydrogen pipeline infrastructure and produce ammonia at scale for export purposes, and take advantage of US IRA credits on the way. Good thing to note about the Gulf Coast is that in Texas, the electricity market is an energy-only market, and it's easier to build projects behind the meter projects in Texas and set up a hydrogen integrated RES and hydrogen project in Texas that can be then used to produce green ammonia that can target the European market and be compliant with RFNBO Delegated Act. But then in addition to that, there's the carbon storage, carbon capture and sequestration available in Texas at scale that can, and cheap gas available as well, that can potentially, increase the supply of blue hydrogen, which can then be exported to Asian markets, which do not have, similar stringent requirements in terms of, additionality and temporal correlation and so on, or even, the carbon intensity of the molecule. So So from a supply standpoint, the Gulf Coast is very well positioned. I think from an export infrastructure standpoint, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So another question for you then, Josie. You know, and as you know, we know in AFRI and a lot of our clients, we're working with a lot of them at the moment to look at the feasibility of projects. And now, when we look at the feasibility of those projects, the first things we probably look at are the capex and the opex. But what other factors should we be thinking about when we look at the feasibility of projects? And I guess in this example, it's ammonia projects.
Okay. Well, if you take the opex and the capex out of the equation, there's still technical risks. So, for example, we are looking at the technology risk or the EPC risk in terms of delivering those facilities. We're finding that that investors are looking at the credibility of the technology suppliers. They're looking at whether or not there's a performance guarantees, what's the risk around it overall for delivering that, delivering the actual plant and getting it into operation. Beyond technical risk, I'd say certainly on sourcing, power sourcing, not only if we look beyond, say, the power costs themselves, also this we look at the structure of the PPA or generally the electricity sourcing. We look at, is there a grid connection? Because actually in reality, we find some projects haven't got a grid connection yet. And we look at whether it's RFMBO compliant, if that's the goal of the project, which it is in many instances, certainly in Europe. I mean, beyond that, we do look at, one of the other risks I would say is around safety and permitting. So we do, within projects, we're doing quite a bit of work there. Also timescales. So some of our recent projects, we've looked a lot at the team who are actually delivering it and if they're able to deliver it, because in reality, this is an emerging industry and there's a lot of people who don't have much experience about getting into place a low carbon ammonia or hydrogen project. So we're doing work there. But on the other side, I'd definitely say offtake is a really key area and just trying to mitigate that risk. So that's around, say, volume risk, and if people are mitigating that in terms of long-term contracts, ideally take or pay, and mitigating that risk, but also price risk and whether or not the off-takers are sharing any of that risk and what's the volatility around revenues, and also the credit risk as well. So I think those are some of the key areas. I'm sure I've forgotten, there's so many different areas you need to look at, but certainly those are some of the key areas that we have looked at. Oh, transport, there you go, I forgot the key one is transport as well, just making sure that product can get to market and actually looking at the logistics and whether or not, so we touched upon it in terms of the presentation today, but sometimes we find we look at the projects that actually logistically you can't really get the product within those timescales of the offtake agreement. So those are the other area that we look at as well.
Okay, thank you. And one very final question, just conscious of the time. So one last question for Hasan. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the barriers that might impact the use of ammonia, particularly as a maritime fuel.
So I mentioned some of the challenges already. I think safety concerns, particularly in terms of deploying ammonia as a maritime fuel at scale as a bunkering fuel, is one of the major challenges. And I think as ammonia bunkering infrastructure gets built out, gets proven out, those type of concerns I'm sure will be top of mind for infrastructure developers and I think for regulatory bodies as well. If you go to grain terminals, there are feasibility studies that look at the explosive potential of even grain movements, right, with the dust being in the air and easily ignitable. The reason I use that analogy is that looking at something like ammonia, which is anhydrous, and if it gets released, can cause quite a bit of concern, especially in large population centers. So looking at the safety aspects of ammonia storage, ammonia transport, ammonia bunkering, I think is one of the major challenges that needs to be sort of addressed for ammonia to be used as a maritime fuel at scale, right? I mean, use of this fuel on ships, in the middle of the ocean, not a big concern. It's the handling at port and the transportation side that is what I'm talking about. The other piece is that if you look at the order book of vessels, methanol of ammonia or methanol powered vessels, methanol has a little bit of a leg up over ammonia, and how ammonia vessels get built and the pace of the build, the timing and scale of sort of number of vessels that get built will also be a major contributor. I think in the interim, ammonia-ready vessels will be quite popular, or more popular than ammonia-only vessels, and simply the reason being that some of the regulatory hurdles before they get solved, we're going to have to sort of have dual powertrain vessels or powertrains that can accept both ammonia and another fuel that can sort of be viable in the interim until we get the bunkering scale and the regulatory side solved. So I'd say those would be two of the major ones.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So I guess that brings us to the end of the webinar today. So I hope you've found some of our insights interesting. My takeaway from this is ammonia, is a really key vector for decarbonisation. But as with all other vectors for decarbonisation, there's no silver bullet. There are some challenges. If challenges can be overcome, but we all need to work together, across investors, project developers, governments, etc., in order to make sure that hydrogen and ammonia can play a role in terms of decarbonisation. So stay tuned with AFRY for more webinars that will be coming up over the summer and into the autumn. I think that's it from us. Nothing left to say other than, please do reach out, please do get in touch. Our contact details are there on the screen. We're always available for discussions with clients, etc. So please do reach out with any questions about ammonia or hydrogen, any other aspects of Power-to-X, both on the consulting, strategy, business case assessment, but also on the technical side where we're very active with our engineering colleagues as well. So thanks for watching. We hope you've enjoyed it, and stay tuned for more webinars coming up soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.